I'd like to thank David and Surinder for inviting us here and for organising this event. And also, of course, to the funding agencies again, the NRN, HEFCU and Welsh Government, of course. What I'm going to do to you today is introduce our project, which is GEO-CARB-CYMRU. We're specifically looking at subsurface energy. And we've kind of got a fairly interdisciplinary team. I'll introduce people later on in detail. But we have Aberystwyth University, where we've got geochemists and microbiologists. We've got Cardiff University, where we have engineers. We've got the BGS, where we, of course, have geologists. We've got National Museum Wales and the Big Pit. We've also got Montana State University, more engineers, and University of Leeds as well, with geochemists. So we've got a kind of a very much a mixed group of people involved in this project. Specifically, what are we interested in? Well, Wales produces a lot of fossil. There's a lot of fossil fuel production, steel production, oil refinery, and we produce quite a lot of carbon. We produce around 8% of the UK's CO2, and we're only around 4.5% of the population. So we are producing more CO2 than we should be on a population basis. So that clearly suggests that we need to develop low carbon energy to tackle climate change and provide energy security, and also really to create jobs. The low carbon economy is really a sort of focus of Welsh Government to sort of develop the economy. What we're going to particularly do is really look at the potential of low carbon subsurface energy. There's been a lot of interest and investment in wind, tidal, solar energy and so on. What we're going to do in this project is specifically look at the underground, the subsurface and the energy potential there. So what are we talking about? Well, we're specifically talking about essentially undertaking fundamental work to characterise and enhance, firstly, geologic carbon storage and also groundwater heating systems in Wales. So there's essentially a dual role here. I'll talk about it more in detail in a moment, but we're talking about essentially geologic carbon storage, of course, is about injecting carbon dioxide in the ground. Of course, this is dealing with polluting industries to start with, but the idea is that we're essentially reducing the carbon impact from these large carbon emitters. Groundwater heating, on the other hand, is of course sort of a proper renewable energy. Now, our EU renewable energy obligation is to source 15% of our energy from renewables by 2020. So there's clearly an impetus to develop renewables and low carbon energy, and the subsurface offers us some potential. So just wanted to introduce the two things we're looking at. I'm sure some of you know about this, others may not. Geologic carbon storage, aka carbon capture and storage. The concept is we produce CO2 from various industries, power production and so on. We essentially capture it, transport it, and then inject it underground. The idea that we lock it away underground, it's not going into the atmosphere. It may turn into a less labile form. We may solidify it in rocks and minerals. And we're going to look at these particular processes in more detail. To meet our UK climate change targets, we really need to decarbonise the power sector by 2030, or that's the ideal, as what policy documents suggest. And the CCS could reduce global CO2 emissions by around 19%. And that it's going to cost around 70% more without doing this. Now, there are lots of pros and cons to CCS, but we're trying to take a little bit of a look at this, specifically in relation to Wales as an exemplar, but also in terms of providing new pure science in this realm. The second major thing we're looking at is geothermal energy. Now, this diagram, I guess, shows the idea of the kind of classic idea of geothermal energy, that being where we have hot, very superheated water coming to the surface in sort of volcanic or geothermal environments. Now, in the UK, we clearly don't have that situation. But the point is there's a lot of energy underground that can be sourced. And we're going to specifically look at that in this project as a way of gaining more understanding about essentially heated groundwater and in particular some geochemical and microbiological processes which might be responsible for particular geothermal hotspots. Again, in Wales, but also this is a global situation. So we're using, again, Wales as an example for this. So our broad aims for this research are threefold. We're firstly going to assess the feasibility, physical constraints and storage capacity in what we call unconventional on and offshore geological reservoirs. By this we mean deep coal seams, shale and sandstone formations, basically using Wales as an exemplar. Carbon capture and storage is traditionally performed in depleted gas reservoirs. We don't really have many of them in Wales, so we're looking at these other potential geological formations which we have in Wales, but as an example globally of these more unconventional storage options. Secondly, we're going to be looking more at the physical, chemical and microbiological controls on the fate and security of the CO2 that we inject in the ground. Again, much work has been done on this of recent, but one particular thing is the microbiological aspect, because very little has been done on that in terms of understanding how this will impact native microbiology, and also how we may be able to utilise subsurface microbiology to improve the storage of the CO2 in the long term. Thirdly, we're going to move on to the geothermal realm, and really just looking at the controls on what we're calling enhanced groundwater heating, particularly looking at specific geochemical, microbially driven geochemical reactions for heating water, and ways in which we potentially can harness these sources. So back to the first aim, this just gives you an idea. Wales shown here, and basically we're firstly going to be characterising essentially the geology of Wales, which could offer storage potential for CO2. We're going to be going from the pore to the reservoir scale, both looking at onshore geology and also offshore formations as well. We have a range of geologies. For example, we have coal, we also have shale, we also have sandstones. So we're interested in looking at essentially what's the capacity of those rocks for storing CO2, how does gas travel in those rocks, and also in relation to what we call cap rocks. They are the rocks that essentially keep the gas underground. What are their properties and how effective will they be at keeping the gas locked up underground? So, as well as the more geological approaches we're going to be using, we're also going to be modelling the transport and fate of carbon dioxide from, again, the pore to the reservoir scale. We can implement various physical, geochemical models to essentially understand gas transport in porous media, again, using Wales as an example, but in particular trying to develop fundamental understanding of these processes. As well as modelling, we can of course we can undertake real experimental work. In the Cardiff University, we've got the facilities to really get a really good handle on how gas travels in different rock types. So again, we'll be using locally collected or Welsh collected rocks samples and looking at how gas can essentially travel through, the permeability of the gas, and also the adsorption, how gas sticks onto subsurface rock. So again, giving us an idea about the long-term potential of Welsh geology for storing carbon dioxide. Now, in relation to that, moving on to that next major aim was really specifically thinking about not only the physical behaviour of gas underground, but also the chemical and microbiological controls on what we would call the security of CO2. Now, basically, the key point here is that microbiology or microbiological activity may have a significant impact on the fate of the carbon dioxide once it's underground. Essentially, the twofold: carbon dioxide may impact subsurface microbial communities, but secondly, subsurface communities may impact the carbon dioxide and specifically enhance the trapping of the carbon dioxide. Basically, can certain biogeochemical reactions actually improve the long-term storage of the CO2, among other things, turning that gas into solid rock. There's a whole slew of essentially biogeochemical reactions that occur underground, and we'll be really looking at the subsurface, how it is at present, and how injecting carbon dioxide into these environments, often as a supercritical fluid, will affect the community, and how the community will affect the carbon dioxide. And we'll be doing this in our HEFQ-funded XL lab, which is an extreme experimental environments lab, which we're just setting up. So firstly then, in a bit more detail, microbiological activity may be affected, may have a significant impact on the fate and the security of the CO2. So firstly, we can see how CO2 may impact subsurface communities. Firstly, by essentially doing genomics. We have the Aberystwyth University Geogenomics Lab, where we're essentially can apply sort of various omic tools to really map out and see how supercritical CO2 or high pressure CO2 will affect the community and also its function. You know, we don't just want to know what's there, but we want to know what's going on, what's turning on and off as we might change these in situ conditions. As well as that, though, how are subsurface communities affected? How may subsurface communities affect the carbon dioxide that's injected? Two things we're really interested in is really how we might be able to actually enhance the long-term storage capacity and also essentially the rate at which our carbon dioxide turns into solid rock through microbiological means. Now, firstly, we're talking about biofilms. This is a picture of a biofilm. This is glass beads. All this stuff in between the beads here is essentially a bacterial goo, essentially. And this can be very effective at blocking the pore space within rock and porous media. If we can manipulate the subsurface to produce biofilm, we've done a lot of work showing that we can actually perturb the movement of gas and therefore engineer a more secure gas storage. Equally, bacteria are very effective at precipitating minerals. They can perturb subsurface geochemistry and ultimately lead to solid minerals forming. For example, here we've got carbonate minerals, calcium carbonate. Again, a potential place the CO2 can end up and be stored efficiently in the long term. As well as that, as a wider range activity, when we do these kind of things, when carbon dioxide is injected into the ground, the injection well and the wellbore in that very proximal zone is an area prone to leakage, not a catastrophic leakage, but a long-term leak in the system. So again, we're looking at ways in which we can potentially engineer, using this biotechnology, very small fractures near perforations in the wellbore, so the well casing through to the cement, through to the rock. Microfracturing is a real problem in these systems, and we're looking at ways in which we can potentially plug these systems up, because they're very inaccessible environments. We do this using various high-pressure reactors, and I guess that's the thing here. Obviously, we're for the project as we're currently running it, we're going to be sort of essentially taking natural samples and then in the lab recreating in situ conditions to kind of get an idea of how the system will respond. So as well as the observations and the experimental stuff, we can also, of course, undertake modelling as well. And we'll basically be using our experiments and integrating modelling to really get an idea of how biogeochemical processes in subsurface systems can affect bacterial growth and the precipitation of minerals and see the mineralization of the carbon dioxide in the ground. We can be, again, scaling is an important issue, both from the pore scale all the way through to the meter, to the kilometre scale, and so on. So we can implement different models at different scales. And we're going to try and integrate various different biogeochemical reactions into our existing gas flow models. Moving on then into, I guess, the last part is really the geothermal part. Now, as I said, as we all imagine geothermal, Iceland, Yellowstone, real hot water coming to the surface. That is one aspect, of course, geothermal energy. But the subsurface offers another source. The first top 15 metres of the ground or so, that is going to be generally heated by annual variations in air temperature. But once we get below that, as we go deeper in the ground, there is an increase in temperature, and that's a fairly, it varies slightly, but it's around 3 degrees per 100 metres with depth. And we can predict that, knowing essentially the properties of the rock and various other parameters fairly accurately. But the really interesting thing is, we appear to have what we would think of as kind of anomalous hotspots in the subsurface, especially when we're talking about water flowing in the subsurface. And it seems that we have good evidence that a lot of this is actually due to microbially driven chemical reactions in the subsurface, which are responsible for heating up water much more than the local water. due to essentially particular mineralogical and microbiological conditions. So we were interested in really looking at the interaction of mineralogy and microbiology and what is going to be producing heat particularly. Therefore, by knowing the particular geological conditions and microbiological environment, we can maybe predict where there are going to be particular hotspots. And therefore, when we're thinking about ground source heat pumps, which are a very underutilized energy source within the UK, we can maybe tap into that and try and help identify very good spots to locate large ground source heat pumps. And another area is actually mine waters. We see that mine waters are often heated beyond the geothermal gradient, and again this appears to be due to microbially driven geochemical reactions. Okay, so finally microbes could also be a problem, and we're going to be looking at this. Biofilms can also be a problem, so when we're thinking about ground source heat pumps, is microbiology an issue? And we'll look at that as well. Who are we? I won't waste your time. We're all here, some of us are here, bunch of people from BGS, Cardiff and Aberystwyth and Montana State University, our international partner, and of course our 3 fellows and 2 PhD students as well. Impact's very important. I won't go into the details, but we're trying to increase the impact of this work, so we've got various impact activities planned, and thanks very much for your time.